today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Kuf Zayin. We are really ending the Masechet very shortly. So reminder to register for the Zoom Siyum, which will take place on Thursday evening Israel time. We're looking forward to seeing you all there. It'll be a good program. And it will be about an hour. Okay, we're going to get started with what we were up to. Today is all about, it's a continuation of different vows and what I mean when I said it. And if you remember, the main difference we discussed yesterday, which we're going to continue with today, is this idea of saying something. If you say, I will do something, bring something to the temple, we have to come up with what's the minimum amount. Because in order to fulfill saying, I will bring something, well, you can fulfill it by, right? It's like, I think of an example, but you say you're going to do something and then you do it as minimal as possible. And then someone says, you didn't do it. You say, what do you mean? I did it. Like, okay, I did it minimum, but I did it. I fulfilled my word. But if I say I was very specific about how much or what the value I was supposed to be bringing was, and I just don't remember, then it's a difference. If I wasn't specific, I can get away with the minimum. If I was specific, but I don't know what it is, then we get to these absurd numbers or requirements. And then we talked about, and really this is going to come up, which is interesting, in the beginning of the next Masechet, there's always links between the end of one Masechet and the beginning. On the first daf already of Chulin, we're going to get to this idea of better not to take a vow, okay? Even though it has nothing to do with Chulin, you'll see how we get there. But it drops in that idea of, it's really not so good to take vows, and that seems to be something that they're talking about here. Be very careful anyway when you do take a vow that either you're very specific about what you want and remember what you're specific about, or keep it general, and then, you can get away with not having to do so much. And the concern always with vows is that you just won't fulfill it, right? Imagine they tell you have to bring 1,380 esronim, that's a little crazy. You might not be able to fulfill that. So anyway, most of our cases today are not as extreme as that, although there are some. So we ended with this case in the braita, Harei alai lemizbech. I'm going to bring something, which we mean here, something that's going to be completely burned on the altar. So what do you have to bring? Levona. The only thing that really gets completely burnt is the frankincense. Now we're going to see it's not exactly the only thing, but it seems to be the main thing that gets burnt completely on the altar, and therefore you bring frankincense. I'm just going back and rereading what we saw yesterday at the end of the daf. That's the only thing that really gets completely burnt. We're going to get back and ask on that immediately, but if I was specific and I said, listen, I know I was specific about which type of item that's going to be burned completely on the altar, but I don't remember exactly which one, then it's obvious here that I mean that there's a few possibilities, and I obviously meant not completely burned, but mostly burned. So then, then I have to bring a few more things. The braita doesn't specify, but Rashi tells us we're talking about things that no remainder goes to the Kohanim. However, there's a bit of it that doesn't exactly go. It's not exact. It doesn't 100% fit the category like we thought before, but it's close, okay? Because no remainder goes to the Kohanim, and we'll see exactly what that is in a minute. But the way we're going to get to what it is, okay, which I already mentioned based on Rashi, it's actually, maybe I'll just mention Rashi, the Olat Ha'of and the Minchat Nesachim, okay, which we're going to see right now why those two are included. V'chulega. So now they go back to the first sentence and say, what? Only Levona is completely burned? What do you mean? Hayika Ola. We always talk about the Ola is Ola Kalil. How many times in Masechet Tzvachim for sure do we say that? It gets, even in Menachot, we discussed it, it gets completely burned. The Ola of an animal. So why wouldn't that be included? So we say no, because it really doesn't get completely burned. Ika Ola LeKohanim. The hide goes to the Kohanim. V'ha'ika Ola Ta'of. Okay, what about the Ola Ta'of, where the Kohen doesn't get any part of it? Ika mu'avenotza, the crop and the feathers get dumped. If you remember, there's this garbage pile called the Beit Hadeshen, right to the east of the ramp. Okay, when you're on the ramp and then you go east a little bit on the ground, there's this pile where they would dump things. That's where they would take the Trumat Hadeshen every day, Tormimat Hadeshen, if you remember. They would put it there, and then also here they would throw the crop and the feather of all the Olat Ha'ofs. And therefore, the whole thing doesn't get completely burnt. It also doesn't go to the Kohanim, and that's why we said it's in the second category. You'd have to bring it. But if you said something that goes completely on the altar, you wouldn't have to do that. Va'ika nisachim, what about libations? So now there's two parts of libations. There's the wine and there's the mincha. So right now they're talking about the wine. So they say definitely, now the wine goes completely on the altar, but it's not burned on the altar. L'shitin azla, you pour it in those holes. Remember, there were cups on top of the holes that went all the way down to the bottom. It was a hollow area of the mizbech. So that's not exactly the same. We assume when you mean the mizbech, you mean to burn on the altar. Okay, but what about the minchat nesachim? Now that we learned actually gets completely burned. There's no komets. Remember, we just discussed that. And it gets completely burned. So why would that be here? So they come up with this answer. It's not the most convincing, but kevan ika mincha da'achli koani mina lo psikale. They didn't want to bring this, they didn't want to talk about this one because there are types of minchas that don't get completely burned. So we assume I didn't mean a mincha because even though there are some that get burned, or one type that gets burned, but since all the others, it's not like a clear-cut case, and therefore they didn't mention it here that you're supposed to bring a mincha. Now we're back to the Mishna where it talked about gold, silver, what you're supposed to bring. So let's just go through the cases again. If you say I'm going to bring gold to the temple, you bring the minimum golden coin, which was a dinar zahav, which is 20 dinar zahav, which is worth 25 of the regular. The dinarim we usually talk about are the same as zuzim. They're 1/25 of this golden dinar. The golden dinar is a different one. The silver dinar is the one we usually discuss. Like a ketubah is worth 200 zuz, which is 200 dinarim, which is the silver one. So the gold one's worth 25 times the value. That's the smallest gold coin, so that's the shear. That's what you have to bring. If I say I'm bringing silver, then it's the silver dinar, which is the one we just said, which is a zuz. If you say nechoshet, though, copper, then you bring copper in the value of a me'av kesef. Okay, so the Gemara actually doesn't deal with why this one is different, but the reason seems to be because if you would bring a prutav nechoshet, okay, a copper coin, think about pennies, right? It's like a copper coin. Well, it's worth nothing, right? No one's going to say I'm bringing copper to the temple and mean the value of a teeny copper coin. So we assume that you didn't mean a coin. We assume you meant like a piece of copper, and therefore you go with copper worth a certain value. Okay, that's the assumption. So now let's go through. Maybe it's a bar of gold, and then it would be like a 3 fingers by 3 fingers. I don't know. You come up with some minimum measurement of what the smallest bar of gold would be. Right? Maybe measure it in ounces or something, but maybe a bar of gold. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Now to answer this question, he's not going to answer it like we've been answering the others. He's going to say, de'amal matbea. This is what we call a ukimta. The Mishnah is only referring to a case where the person said a coin of gold. If they didn't say a coin of gold, now it's interesting, the Gemara doesn't tell you, but if they didn't say a coin of gold, it would be a bar of gold. And then you would have to come up with what the shear is. Right? It didn't say here. Vidilma prete, maybe they mean coins, like small golden coins, and not this dinar zahav, which is worth a lot of money. Rav Papa, prete dedava lo avdei nashe. People don't make golden coins, okay? There is no such thing. Kesef leifchot midina. Or even if there is such a thing, right? It's just so atypical. And obviously there was such a thing, and that's why they were asking. But it's so uncommon that definitely it's not what you were referring to. Okay, kesef leifchot midina. They're going to do the exact same thing here. Vidilma naska. Maybe it means a brick of silver. Amar, or a chunk. Amar Rabbi Elazar, de Amar matbea. You must have said a coin, okay? The same Rabbi Elazar and the same Ukimta. He said the Mishnah must be talking about where you said a coin of silver. Vidilma prete, maybe you meant silver coins. Now, silver coins are more common than gold coins. There is such a thing, so maybe it's something worth less than a dinar. Amar of Sheshet, ba'atra de lo sagu prete de kaspa. He gives another Ukimta. He says the Mishnah must be referring to a place where it wasn't common to use silver coins. So even though there are places where it's common, the Mishnah is talking about a place where it's not, which again leads you to say that if you were in a place where it was common to use silver coins and you said silver, you'd be able to fulfill your obligation with a small silver coin and not, like a penny type coin and not the dinar, the silver dinar. Nechoshet lo yivchot mima'at kesef. Okay, so this one already was different, stood out a little different than the others. And here we're going to actually have a machloket. We're going to bring a braita with a different opinion. We're not going to see a machloket between two people, but our Mishnah says one. You bring a brick of copper, the amount of copper that is worth me'av kesef, which we said was a sixth of that silver dinar. But in a braita, Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Omer lo yivchot mitzinorak tana shel nechoshet. Says it should be no less than like a fork or some sort of tongs of copper. Okay, so basically he says find a tool that people use that's really small. And by the way, I think because it's also used in the temple, because what are you going to use this for? Lamai chazi, what's this used for? This small copper utensil. It could be used for the menorah, to scrape the wicks or to clean the lamps. So that has a use in the temple, and therefore we can assume that maybe you meant something as small as that, which we assume is worth less than this sixth of a dinar. Okay, now they're adding a case that wasn't in the Mishnah. Barzel, what if you say you're promising iron? What is iron used for in the temple? Again, you have to assume, this is why they connected it with the wicks, has to be something of use in the temple. So it could be something small, but as long as it's useful in the temple, then, it could be not a lot of value, but then we assume that could be what you meant. So Tanya in the braita it says, Achirim omrim, others say, now you understand why they brought up Barzel, because there's a braita about it. So our Mishna didn't discuss it, but the braita does. Lo yivchot mikalya orev. This is a way they would keep away the birds, the ravens. Right, we all know if you're in Jerusalem, right, there's always all these birds flying around. Obviously in the temple there were birds. They wanted to keep them away. So these were spiky, okay, it seems we're going to see in a minute, okay, I'm Rav Yosef. Let's just read and then I'll finish my sentence. V'kama, how big is, like how much Barzel iron do you need for this? Rav Yosef ama. It's a cubit by a cubit size. Now if you're thinking of spikes, they're not really, you wouldn't measure them a cubit by a cubit. It must have been like a piece of metal that's like the base of it, of the iron, made of iron, and then it had spikes coming out of it. Okay, that's the way I imagine it, and that would keep away the birds. So according to the first version, the braita basically talks about this utensil that they, this item that they used, and then Rav Yosef gave it an amount. How much would that be? How big? But Ikad Amre, some people have a different version. Lo yivchot me'ama lama, that the braita said it has to be 1 cubit by 1 cubit, but didn't say for what purpose this was used for. And Lamai Chazi, and then they asked, you have to remember the time that elapsed from the time of the Tanaim, whenever this braita is from, but sometime in the time of the Tanaim, until we get to Rav Yosef, who's a third generation Amora. So we're having two sources, but one was much, much earlier, and the other was a comment on the earlier one. So did the early one give the item that it was, and then Rav Yosef gave it the shear, or did the earlier source give the shear, the amount, and then Rav Yosef came and said, they said, what can you use this for? And Rabbi Yosef said, l'kalya orev, okay, for chasing away the birds. Mishna. Hare alai yayin, lo yivchot mishlosha lugin. Shemen lo yivchot milog. So now we're up to items that obviously what's their use in the temple. Wine for libations, oil also for, libations. And you can always bring voluntary ones, right? So this obviously is voluntary because you're bringing a neder. And if you want, we learned that you could be minadev yayin, and there was this machloket, can you be minadev shemen? But there is an opinion that you could, right, we saw machloket Rabbi Tar from Rabbi Akiva, can you voluntarily offer oil? So the Mishnah says, if you say yayin, now it doesn't interest us, is there such a thing? We're assuming there is such a thing. The question is, how much? So it makes sense to say, if you say, I'll bring wine, lo yivchot mishlosha lugin, the minimum is 3 log. Why? Because the only wine we see in the temple is the wine libations, and how much were they that went along with the sacrifices, the obligatory ones, and the minimum is 3 log. Remember, revi tahin for the keves, for the lamb or the sheep. So can't be less than 3 log. If you say shemen, I'm going to bring lo yivchot mi log, 1 log. Rebbi omer shlosha lugin. So one says 1, one says 3. The obvious difference is in the Minchat Nisachim, if you remember. There, the oil is the same as the wine. So if you're going to learn it from there, you're going to say 3 log. But if you learn it in the mincha, every mincha, remember, gets a log per isaron, or maybe 1 log for however many esronim you have. That was a machloket. But a 1 log is a shear for oil in general, and maybe then that's enough to go with the minimum. So we're going to see in the Gemara exactly what the machloket is between the two of them, what the basis is, but that's already to get in your head where these two amounts come from. But if you say perashti ve'eni odama perashti, look, I specified an amount, and I just don't remember what I specified, yavi ki yom merubeh. Then again, what do we have to do? We have to go by the largest possible number, the largest number of the highest amount of oil or wine that you could bring to the temple on any given day. Okay, and we'll see later what that day is, even though we already know, and then we'll get to figuring out the amounts. How much will that be? Gemara starts off, Tanu Rabbanan, Ezrach, Melamed Sheminadvim Yain. Now, where do we get this idea that anyone can just donate wine? Because the only time wine comes up in the Torah is specifically with the libations, where you're obligated. There is no voluntary wine offering. But in the section in Bamidbar, chapter 15, where it talks about about the obligatory offerings that people have to bring, the nisachim, that go together with the libations, that go together with the sacrifices, it says there, Kol ha'ezrach yaseh kacha et eleh, any citizen will do like this. Now, obviously, the simple reading is every citizen has to bring libations with their sacrifices. But the way they darshan this, citizen means everybody, meaning if everybody wants to, they can also volunteer. That's the drasha. So now they say, V'kama, and how much? L'shadugin. Okay, that's obvious because that's the amount learned from there. Uminayin shemartzalo sif yosif. How do you know if you want to add more? You can. Tamud lamal yihiyeh. Okay, because it says the word yihiyeh will be for you. Will be for you means you can do as many as you want. Okay, it's a bit of a distant drasha. Also, there happens to be a debate about which yihiyeh they're talking about. Rashi says it's from the same section there, and it comes from this pasuk. Then 2 psukim later, we're in chapter 15, verse 15 in Bamidbar. Hakal chukach hadachem v'lager agar chukat olam l'dorotechem kachem kager yihiyeh lifnei Hashem. This would be a rule for you, and even for the ger and for the convert, and it will be before God. So it will be seems to say, oh, you can add. Some people think it's a pasuk in Bamidbar at the end where it talks about all the different sacrifices you bring and the libations you bring with the sacrifices on the different holidays, and there's a yihiyeh there where it's talking specifically about the amounts, which kind of makes a little more sense because the yihiyeh relates to the amounts there. On the other hand, this one's in the same section, so you can see why there's, when they just quote a pasuk yihiyeh, there's lots of psukim with the word yihiyeh in it. It's not so clear cut. Yachol yivchot. So now the braita continues. You might think you could do less. Talmud Lomar, because, maybe you can just volunteer anything you want. Kacha, because it says from the first pasuk, Kol ha'ezrach yaseh kacha, will do like this, meaning you can't do any less than this. Lo yivchot min alog Rebbi omer shlosha lugin. Now we're going to have this machloket. I'll already tell you the structure of what's going to happen. Rabbis are going to come before Rav Papa, unnamed rabbis. The rabbis said before Rav Papa, maybe his student colleagues. They came before him and they said, we think this is the basis of the machloket. And Rav Papa says, that's not the basis of the machloket, you're wrong. And then in comes Rav Huna bar Natan and says, the son of Rav Natan, and he says, but Rav Papa, with all due respect, I have a braita that clearly contradicts what you just said. And then Rav Papa's going to say, oh, if there's a braita, and then I guess I'm wrong. Okay, which is always good to admit you're wrong, right? When you come up with a nice theory, but then the braita contradicts you, so he realized he was wrong. So that's the structure. And one other word of intro before we get there, which is the first way we're going to read this is it's based on a machloket of how to use these hermeneutical principles. Okay, there's a principle called don mina. There's a machloket about how we do this. Don mina umina, we've learned this before, or don mina va'oke ba'atra. So what does this mean? We'll explain the words and we'll explain what it means. Don mina, they both start off, both options start of don mina, learn from it. Okay, this is where we're going to derive one halacha from a different halacha. So we're going to derive a principle about our topic, which is the oil, and we're going to derive it from somewhere else. The somewhere else is going to be from the mincha, okay, not from the section of the libations, but from the mincha. We're going to say, we learn from the mincha that there's such a thing of libations. And then the question is going to be, when you do don mina, which means learn from it, umina means not just learn the principle from it, but learn all the details as well from that other place. And the other option is to say, no, don mina, okay, get the principle from somewhere else. But in the end, the details, don mina va'oke ba'atra, but then learn about it in its place. Meaning, if these are libations, and we're learning, right, then the details should be more like the libation details. If you remember, what's the difference? The mincha has the 1 log, and the libations have 3 log. So if you're going to learn it from the mincha, we'll learn it completely, and there it's a log. If you're going to learn it from mincha, that there is a concept that you can voluntarily offer oil, but the details are going to come from the libations. Well, the libations are the the oil and the wine is 3, so the oil should be 3. So that's basically the machloka between them, the way the rabbis are going to set it up. So now let's read it inside. What's the root of their machloket? Rabbanan came Rav Papa. So this is what I said. The rabbis came before Rav Papa and they suggested this is the basis of the machloket. Bidomina umina, bidomina v'okim ba'atra kan miflaget. Right? Their machloket is domina umina or domina v'okim ba'atra. Which one do you go by? Rabbanan savri domina umina. The rabbis who said one log said learn it from mincha and learn it completely from mincha. All the details as well. Ma mincha. So first you have to do, what do we learn? Ma mincha mitnadvim. Just like a mincha, you have a voluntary offering. Av shemen nami mitnadvim. How do you learn it from there? If you remember, we did this with the wood as well. It says ki yakriv adam nefesh ki takriv mincha korban mincha, and it said korban. Why did it say korban? To include not just a mincha be offered voluntarily, but also wood, also oil. Okay, so if you're going to learn it from there, that's the source. Then you're going to learn it completely from there. Umina ma mincha belog av shemen belog. So the concept, because remember, that whole section was the beginning section where it talks about the 5 voluntary mincha offerings that we've been discussing. First the solet, then the machva, mercheshet, right, and all those 5. So there you can do a mincha voluntarily. And there, how much oil do you use? 1 log. So we're going to learn it completely from there, and it's 1 log. And Rebbi saval, domina v'okeh ba'atra. No, learn from there, but then the details are going to come from the libations themselves. Ma mincha mitnadvim, af shemen nami mitnadvim. So again, the principle is learned from there, just like a mincha. You bring voluntarily, also oil you can bring voluntarily. Ve'okeh ba'atra, but learn it from the details of the mincha, of the oil itself. Kinisachim, like the libations. Ma nisachim shloshet lugin, af shemen nami shloshet lugin. So the only other place where we have oil is, or the main other place, there is one other case, if you remember, with the leper, where he brings the 1 log of shemen, but that's a unique case. But the main other part of oil is when it goes with the libations of the sacrifices. There it's actually mixed in with the mincha also. But there it's 3 log. Now why 3 log? Well, 3 log is the minimum, remember? For the sheep and the lambs, it's 3 log. So the minimum is 3 log. So it should be like nisachim. Ma nisachim shloshet lugin, av shemen nami shloshet lugin. So the oil here should be 3 log. But as I told you, Rav Papa is going to reject this. Amar lahu Rav Papa. Rav Papa said to these rabbis, Imi mincha gamar la Rebbi tekule amalu pligi domina mina. If Rebbi thinks that you learn, like which they just said, because everybody learns it from the mincha, then of course he's going to say you're going to learn it from the mincha. It's only 1 log, and that's not what Rebbi said. Rebbi says it's 3 log. So I don't agree with you, because I think if he were going to learn it from the mincha, he would learn it completely from the mincha. There's no reason to learn the details from the libations. Like the mincha also has shemen, and it's 1 log, so we should just learn it from there. Ela Rebbi, he must learn it from somewhere else, basically. The source for this principle is not actually from far away, and then the question is domina umina or okeh ba'atra, but Rebbi learns it me'ezrach gamerle. Just like we learned there's voluntary wine in the section about the libations where it talks about libations of wine, there's also oil there. So the word ezrach should include oil voluntary sacrifices as well. And then, obviously, you're going to get to 3 log because that's the context. So Rav Papa sounds like it's a pretty convincing argument. But, as I said, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Natan, is going to come and reject this based on a braita. Amar le Rav Huna berei Rav Natan le Rav Papa. Umi matzid amar hachi, can you really say that? V'hatanya, look at this braita. It says in a braita, korban. Milamed shemitnadvim shemen. According to this braita, what's the source? The fact that you can voluntarily offer shemen. Korban. Where's that? In the mincha section. Now, if you're going to say this is the rabbis, then you're expecting, because only the rabbis learned from the mincha, according to Rav Papa, then you're expecting it to say how much oil? 1 log. But what does it say here? Bekama, how much? Shloshet lugin, it says 3 log. So this can't possibly be, right? It doesn't make sense. You can't say that this is mansham, that Rebbi holds it's 3 log because we learn it from the libations. This says we learn it from the mincha and it's 3 log. So basically he says, Man shamat le'damar shloshet lugin Rebbi. Who's the one who says 3 log? Rebbi says 3 log. V'kamai telami korban, and he learns it from the mincha, not like you just claimed that he learns it from the libations. So Amar le, like I said, Rav Papa gives up and he says, okay, Tanya. If there's a braita, and I guess I'm wrong. Okay. With that, we move to the next case, and this we'll start using the study guide. If I said I specified a certain amount of libations, I have no recollection how much, we go by the largest possible amount that I could bring. Okay, now the Gemara doesn't tell us what this is, but they do tell us what day you bring it, which is the Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag Shechal Yom B'Shabbat. So for those who like numbers, we're now going to go through the numbers of how much you bring, okay? So if you remember, we did this already on Sukkot. You bring 13 parim, 13 bulls, 2 rams, 14 sheep. That's the Sukkot sacrifice. If it comes out on Shabbat, you have to bring 2 sheep for Shabbat, or 2 lambs. For the Shnei Kvasim, right, if you remember the davening on Musaf, every Shabbat, we say Shnei Kvasim B'nei Shana Tamimim. Okay, that's the 2 Kvasim. And the Korban Tamid, you need 2 Kvasim. So now let's go through our amounts. So first of all, I did we did this recently because we did the 61, and that's how we got to the 60. Esronim, that's not our topic today. But if we're already here, we have the chart, 13 bulls times 3, remember, 1 Isaron for the Kvasim, 2 Esronim for the Ayil, and 3 for the Par. So 13 times 3 is 39, the 2 Elim times 2 is 4, the 14 Kvasim is 1, and the 2 Kvasim and the 2 Kvasim is another, right, 1 per. So 14, 2, 2, we get to 61. Now let's talk about the oil. So what's the measurement? So we talked about the sheep is 3, right, 3 per sheep. The ram is 4 per sheep, right, the Shlishit Hahin. And the Par, the bull, is Chatzi Hahin, which is 6, okay, because remember the Hin is 12 log. So 6 times 13, because of 13 parim, you need 6 each. So you're going to get to 78. 2 rams times 4 per ram, you're going to get to 8. And then we have the 14 and the 2 and the 2, so basically 18 sheep, right? You're going to get to the 14 or 42, because you're going to multiply it by 3 log. And then 6 and 6, and altogether, if you add 78 plus 8 plus 42 plus 6 plus 6, you're going to get to 140. So you have to bring 140 log. Again, we're back to an extreme number of 140 log of oil you're going to have to pour on the altar. Okay, next. Hare alai ola. New Mishnah. If you say, and this we quoted, some of these parts of this Mishnah we've quoted previously, if you say, I'm going to bring an ola, yavi keves. So you have to bring the smallest possible animal. Today we're going to see the amount these animals cost. And you'll see the huge price discrepancy. I don't buy animals, so I don't really know what animals should cost. But it's a really big price discrepancy between the bull and the lamb or the sheep, which is the least expensive. Anyway, so you're going to bring a keves. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer or Torah ben Yonah. You said ola, which could include birds as well. So the birds presumably are cheaper. I say presumably, we're going to see in the Gemara what exactly the machlokah between the two of them is. But if you say, again, the 2 different cases, perashti min bakar ve'eni yodea ma perashti. Now, I said I was going to bring from cattle, but I didn't specify which I don't remember which cattle I specified. I specified one type of cattle. You know, cattle breaks into the big ones and the small ones, the bulls and the baby ones, right? The calves. So now, okay, first of all, you have to remember we're within Korban Ola. Korban Ola can only be male, and that's why we're only talking about the bull and the calf, and not the female, which is the cow. So, yavi, par, ve'egel. So you're going to have to bring 2 animals, because you don't know which one. Did you do the big one or the small one? Mina bema ve'eni yodea ma perashti. Now we're going to get more specific. So you said an ola, you said it was from an animal, but you didn't say, right, you didn't say bakar, cattle, you said animal, which is a much more general phrase, but I'm not sure which one. Yavi par ve'egel, ayil seir, gedi v'taleh. So you have to bring the big and the small of, right, the bull and its calf, the ram and the goat, and the gedi and the taleh, right, which is the babies of each of those. Okay, so now you have to, by the way, the seir and the gedi go together, and the ayil and the taleh go together. Taleh and keves are used interchangeably here, even though in English, keves translates as sheep, and taleh translates as lamb. Okay, but they're really they seem to be synonymous because they're used interchangeably. Perashti ve'eni yodea ma perashti. And if you say, I said I was going to bring an ola, you didn't say from an animal, you just said, I said I would bring an ola, and as opposed to before we said you just bring the cheapest, but I'm not sure, but I was specific about which one, I just don't remember what. Well, now you're going to have to turn out to Amabet, Mosifa lehen Torah ben Yonah. You're going to have to add a bird, okay, both type of birds, because maybe you included birds. When you said from the animals, obviously that didn't include birds, but now that you said, I did some type for an ola, but I don't know which one. Now we're going to do the exact same thing for a toda and a shlamim. The difference between a toda and shlamim is one difference, which is it can be brought with a female animal or male. So now we're going to have to add to all the possibilities we just discussed, the female ones. So harei alai toda u'shlamim yavi keves. Okay, this is just saying, okay, this could be a keves or a female. Okay, it doesn't matter. It just has to be, right, the cheapest one you have to bring. Now, you can obviously bring a bigger one, but since you weren't specific at all, and all you said was, I will bring an animal for a toda, you weren't specific at all, you bring the minimum. By the way, there's the other difference is there's no birds. You can't bring, there's only ola. The birds can only be brought as an ola, or if you remember, a chatat. Okay, but a sin offering, but not for a toda or a shlamim. So there's no birds here. So those are the two differences. We add females, but we cut out the bird option. Perashti mina bakal. I said I would bring a toda or a shlamim from the cattle family, but I don't remember what I specified. I specified one type. I don't remember. So now we're going to have to add the females. Yavi pal upara, egel ve'egla. Okay, the female calves and the cow, in addition to the bull. Mina be'ema ve'eni yodea ma perashti, from the animal, and I'm not sure which one. Yavi par para, egel ve'egla, ayel urechela, sir v'sira, gdi ugdia, talevet talia. Okay, here you get the whole lesson in what the female counterparts are to all these male animals we saw. Harei alai shol, yavihu unisacha. Okay, now, next section. What if I say I'm bringing a shor? Now we want to know, I'm bringing an ox for the altar. The question is, what value do I have to bring? And I have to buy an ox now, but can I buy a really cheap one? What's the amount of money I need to spend? So they tell you exactly how much money you need to spend. Okay? Now, obviously, this is in a particular time, in a particular place when the price was this. Okay? Obviously, it might change, over time. But, they give you the amount that the shor together with the libations should come out to. And they say it's a maneh. Maneh is 100 dinarim. It's actually a lot of money. Okay, 100 dinarim's worth of everything. Then that's your total bill for the ox, for the flour, for the oil, the wine, all that stuff that has to go with the animal, has to add up to 100 dinarim. Egel, if you say calf, we're going to see a big price difference. Yavihu unisachav bechamesh. Now what's chamesh? It's not chamesh, okay, maneh, it's not 5 dinarim, it's 5 slaim. We're now moving into slaim. Slaim are worth 4 dinarim. So 5 times 4 is 20. So this is the value of a calf is a fifth of the value of the shor, of the ox itself. Ayil yavihu nesachav b'shtayim. If you say a ram, that's worth 2 slaim, which is already, right, that's going to be 2 times 4 is 8 dinarim. And keves yavihu nesachav b'sela. That's worth 4 dinarim. You see the difference. The keves is 4 dinarim, whereas the shor is worth 100 dinarim. But again, this is not just the animal itself, it's the animal with the libations. But still, there's a huge, huge price difference. But if you said the following, shol b'maneh, I'm going to bring a shor in the value of 100 dinarim, yavi b'maneh chutz minesachav. In this case, you said shor for a maneh. That means you have to spend the whole maneh on the shor. And in addition, you have to get libations, but that's not included in the maneh. In the previous, you said shor, we're going to say, okay, shor and libations should add up to 100. But this time you said the shor is going to be 100, so you can't do any less than 100 for the shor itself. And then add the nisachim. Same thing, egel b'chamesh, if you said, I'm going to bring a calf for 5 slaim for the 20 dinarim, yavi b'chamesh chutz min nisachav. So you're going to bring it 5 slaim plus the libations. This is just the exact same thing. Ayel b'shtayim, a ram for 2, you said. Yavi b'shtayim chutz min nisachav. You have to bring a value to 2 plus the libations. Keves b'sela, yavi b'sela chutz min nisachav. If you said the keves for a sela, by the way, this would be for any amount you said. It doesn't matter. They're just bringing the examples of what we used in the previous. You would have to bring one worth a sela and then the libations on top of that. Shor b'maneh, vevi shnayim b'maneh. What if you said, I'm going to bring an ox for a value of 100? And what'd you do? You brought 2 oxen, each for the value of 50, but together you got to 100. Would that fulfill your obligation? No, lo yatsa, because you said 1 shor b'maneh. Obviously that 1 shor is going to be, a better animal, worth more, so you can't do that. But a filu, zeh b'maneh chaser dinar, v'zeh b'maneh chaser dinar, if each one was 99 dinarim. So you were close, and altogether you went over 100 anyway, still doesn't work. Okay, we're going to see this is no good because you still didn't do what you promised. You said you were going to bring a shor that was worth 100 and you didn't, even if it's worth 99. Shachor vevi lavan, lavan vevi shachor. We're going to have all these cases that don't work. You said you're going to bring a black animal and you brought a white one, or white and you brought black. Gadol vevi katan, lo yatsa. If you said you were going to bring, and this we quoted yesterday, or 2 days ago, I don't remember, but we just quoted this. If you said you're going to bring a large one and you ended up bringing a smaller one, you're not going to fulfill your obligation. However, katan vehivi gadol yatsa. If you say you're going to bring a small animal and you brought a larger one, you would fulfill your obligation. Why? Because the small animal is included in the big one, right? Like the same way you bring 5 of something, you've actually brought 4 of something plus another one. So you bring, you say you're going to bring an egel, a calf, and you bring a par, it's actually going to work. Okay, this is going to create a bit of a problem with something we saw earlier in the Mishna. Right? Why do you have to bring a par and an egel then? It should work if you just bring a par, it'll cover everything. So we'll get back to that. But Rebbi Omer lo yatsa. Rebbi says that's no good. You can't do that. Okay? Now, the Gemara said, because you have to bring exactly what you promised. So first, we're going back to the very first line, which was, if you say I'm going to bring an ola, you either bring a keves, according to Tanakama, a sheep. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, you bring a bird. Now, we assume the birds are cheaper, right? So why would the first opinion really say you have to bring a sheep? So, lo pligi, they actually don't disagree. Marki atre. Each person was talking within his own community, meaning it depends where you live, whether the chicken is cheaper than the sheep, or the sheep is cheaper than the chicken. Okay, depends on all. Right, we all know how price fluctuates, and the birds in the place where Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah lived were cheaper. Okay, but in the place where the Tanakama, whoever the Tanakama is, lived, the sheep were cheaper than the birds. Okay, and that's why each one said something different. So they don't disagree in principle. Tanu Rabbanan, Harei alai ola besela lamizbeach. If you say I'm going to bring an ola in the value of a sela on the altar, yavi keves, because she'en l'chad davar kareh besela l'gabei mizbeach ela keves. Because the only thing that really gets burnt on the altar, that's the value of a keves, is the value of an ola. That would be the value of a sela as a sheep. It's the only thing that could come that cheap. But if you say, perashi, I said I was going to bring something on the altar that's worth a sela, ve'eni odea ma perashi, but I'm not sure which one. Now, here again, it's obvious that there's options, because otherwise you would know it was a keves. So, yavi mikol davar shekareh b'sela l'gabei mizbeach. So then you bring from everything that's worth a sela that could go on the altar. Now, we just said nothing else can. Nothing else can if it's a korban ola. But you could bring a mincha, for example, that could be worth a sela, or frankincense could be worth a sela. So you have to bring those other things, because in this case, right, you have to bring all those. The sheep, the frankincense, and a mincha offering that's worth a sela. Now we're going to get back to what I said before, that this seems to contradict the later part of the Mishnah. So they say, it's either way, you could bring a par. A par should cover you, because if you were going to bring an egel, so the par includes the egel, because the par is bigger than the egel. So that's the katan vevi gadol, according to Tanakama yatsa. To which the Gemara says, Hamani Rebbi, this must be Rebbi. And that's why. So the beginning of our Mishnah must be Rebbi. Now the Gemara is going to say, that doesn't make any sense. Because, right, first they say, Da'amar, as he said, in case you didn't remember, katan vevi gadol lo yatsa. If you promised a small one and you brought a larger one, it wouldn't work. You wouldn't fulfill your obligation. So they say, and that's why you'd have to bring both the par and the egel, because you have to bring exactly what you said, and you don't know what you said, so bring them both. But then they say, Rebbi, then the Mishnah doesn't read well at all. Why? If you're going to say Rebbi, ema seifa. At the end of the Mishnah it says, and for some reason they start quoting from not the very end, but we're just going to repeat all what we just read at the end of the Mishnah. Shor b'maneh v'vishnayim b'maneh lo yatsa, v'afilu zeh b'maneh chaser dinar v'zeh b'maneh chaser dinar. If you brought a shor b'maneh, you said shor b'maneh, and then you brought 2 instead, or even if you brought each one 99. Or shachor vevi lavan, lavan vevi shachor, black and you brought white, or white and you brought black. Gadol vevi katan, now we're up to our issue, lo yatsa. If you said you bring a large animal, you brought a small one, it wouldn't work. But katan vevi gadol yatsa, and then Rebbi Omer lo yatsa. So what's the problem here? Well, Reisha v'sefer Rebbi mitziata Rabbanan. The Mishnah starts off with the base opinion, Tanakama. And then at the end, it also mentions Tanakama, and then it mentions Rebbi. Now, if you're going to say that the base opinion in the beginning was Rebbi, the order doesn't make sense. It starts with Rebbi, then this later part is all the rabbis, and then it goes back to Rebbi. That's zigzagging between the opinions. It doesn't make sense to say the Mishnah works like that, which we've asked this question in a lot of sugyas, and often in the end, because we have no choice, we say, why is that bothering you? Yeah, it's true. This is the way to read it. Reisha v'sefer Rebbi, mitziat Rabbanan. Now, sometimes they answer this question and they leave it at that. Yeah, it zigzags. Here they're going to explain the zigzag. And they say, v'hachi kamar, and this is how to understand it. This is how to read the Mishnah. Davar ze machloket Rebbi v'Rabbanan. In other words, the Mishnah starts off with Rebbi's opinion. And that was the whole why you have to bring the par and the egel. It's not enough to just bring a par. If you say, I specified, I'm not sure which bakar I did, why do you have to bring the small one? It's included in the large one. Well, it's because it's Rebbi's opinion, who doesn't allow that. And then, after telling you Rebbi's opinion without letting you know it was Rebbi, at the end of the Mishnah they say, by the way, this is a machloket Rebbi and the rabbis. Okay, this is Rebbi's opinion that we brought earlier. And the machloket brought at the end is to tell you, it's a weak reading. I mean, it's hard to read the Mishnah like that, but it's telling you that what we said earlier is Rebbi. Again, whenever you have a tough reading of the Mishnah, it's because they have no choice. It doesn't read well the other way is either. Tnan hatam. Now we're starting with the Mishnah. This is kind of leaving our topic, but you'll see in a minute why it comes back here. What this has to do with it, we're going to bring a Mishnah from Masechet Shkalim. And for this is the chart at the end of the daf. And we're not going to actually do most of it today, but I did chart it out through till tomorrow's daf, which is, we're going to have this Shishala Nidava. Okay, it's a Mishnah Masechet Shkalim, which we actually quoted, just quoted it in the Gemara. I'll look what daf it came up on. Ready? On Kuf Dalid, okay? Plus it comes up in a lot of other places. In the Beit HaMikdash, there were these 6 kupot, there were 13 kupot, like stucco boxes, okay? They were shaped like shofarot, narrow at the top, wide at the bottom, so that people couldn't put their hands in and try to get the stuff out, right? They had a very narrow opening to make it very difficult to steal from there. And 7 of them were for obligatory offerings, like if you owed a bird, a pair of birds, that was one. If you owed an ola, you would put money in one, okay? But if the 6 of them were not for obligations, but for voluntary offerings. Okay, so what kind of voluntary offerings and what were they here for and why do we have 6? So we're going to have here 6 different opinions. Okay, it's an easy way to remember it. There's 6 for Nidava, and there's 6 different opinions about what was the purpose of having these. And one of them is going to relate to our topic and be according to Rebbi, and that's why we brought this here. Okay, but we're going to get into this whole long thing anyway, even though only one small part of it is for us. And what you can see from the chart is we're going to have the 6 opinions, and then there's going to be difficulties like what? Because whenever you have 6 opinions, obviously each one has some difficulty with it. Otherwise, why would you have so many opinions, right? So we're going to raise a difficulty with each of them, but that's all for tomorrow. So we'll start with the first few. Keneged me, what are they for? And there's a siman for the 6 rabbis that comment on these, even though they're weird simanim, like kuf is for chizkiah. Okay, we would normally say chet, but they did kuf, which is in the middle of the word. Anyway, that's less significant for me right now. Amar chizkiah, keneged shisha batei avot hakohanim shetiknu lehem chachamim sheyeh shalom zeh im zeh. Okay, anyone who remembers Masechet Yoma knows that the Kohanim, there's always concern of them fighting. Maybe there really was a lot of fighting. We know there was crazy cases that actually really did happen, and there was a lot of competition between them. Now, every week you got to work in the temple. If you were a Kohen, there was a mishmar, and you would go to work, but you wouldn't work all those days. There were 6 batei avot. That means each family that went to work, they would work 2 weeks a year, plus on the holidays. When they would go to work, they would divide them into 6. And each one would work a different day of the week, and on Shabbat they would all work, at least according to most opinions. Some people say there were 7. But anyway, let's just stick with the 6. Now, each of them would basically get, on the day you worked, you got, if there were voluntary offerings, you got the hides of those offerings. And also if they were obligatory, like Ola, we started our daf with that. The Ola goes to the hide goes to the Kohanim. So what did they do to make it fair? Okay, they would say, so they wouldn't get upset at each other and say, oh, you got lucky, you got this day, I got that day. They just said, okay, there's 6 kupot here, assuming they were reasonably evenly divided, from the Nidava money that comes in. Any money that goes to Nidava goes into these 6 boxes. And then each day, a different group of Kohanim, right, whatever family was working that day, got from a different box. So there were 6 kupot staka there, so to speak. They weren't stucco boxes, but light stucco boxes. And each day you were on, you got that box. And then you couldn't complain. Like, oh, you got that. Yeah, I mean, you still could complain because you could say, oh, there was more in yours than was in mine. But it definitely minimizes fighting and jealousy. Next opinion. Rabbi Yochanan Amar. So according to him, the money was distributed randomly. Like it came from all different places, but like it was all money that was given for voluntary offerings. Remember we talked about motar, like extra money goes to there. Anything that was any kind of nidava would go in there, all kinds. The second opinion, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, mitoch shenidava merubat tiknu lam shofarot merubim kidei shelo yitabshu hamaot. If you notice, these two make no distinction between all six. Okay, all the money went in randomly, and Rabbi Yochanan says there was so many voluntary offerings that they didn't want the money to get moldy if you put too much in one box, so they divided it into 6. Okay, but now we're going to start, and you can see from the chart, that these each say each one had its own unique role. And we're just going to learn Ze'eri today. Ze'eri amal keneged pal ve'egel ayel ve'keves gedi ve'seir. Okay, you put different, each one was for a different, if I voluntarily wanted to bring a bull, then I would put it in the bull box, and I would put my 100, and then there would be 300 in there, and the Kohen would know there were 3 people, and he would buy with it 3 bulls, and offer them for the people, and say in them when there was the egel, there was the ayel, there was the keves, the gedi, the seir. Now, we already learned the par and the egel, right? Big and small. Ayel and keves, big and small. Gedi and seir, also big and small. Okay, so now, the gedi is the baby, and the seir is the bigger one. So now they say, v'Rebbi Ze'eri obviously held like Rebbi, because Damar katan ve'vi gadol lo yatsa. Because you need to separate the smaller and the larger one, because if you said you're going to bring a small one and you brought a larger one, you would fulfill your obligation according to the rabbis. So you wouldn't need to separate them into separate kupot. It would be enough to have them all together. And therefore, this Ze'eri must hold like Rebbi, and that's why we brought this whole thing. We're going to see the other 3 opinions tomorrow, and like I said, we're going to analyze them. So what did we do today? We went through all these different cases that we saw of I like that, Miriam, that his name is Ze'eri, which is small. Very good. Okay, so we saw all these different things. I'm not going to even go into all the details, but what you said and what you have to bring, and the main difference is if you said something, then you just bring the minimum. If you said, I was specific about it, I just don't remember how specific I was, right? If you weren't specific at all, we go by the minimum. If you're specific and you don't know, you have to bring the larger amount, and we went through in all these different cases what the larger amount is. We had a few kimtot, that like why the Mishna say gold coin and not gold bar, and then we had the whole machloket about the oil, what the minimum is. Is it a log? Is it 3? And what's the machloket based on? And the whole back and forth with the rabbis and Rav Papa about it. And we got to what's the minimum for a korban? What value? How much do you have to spend on it? And again, with your words, what are the effects of your words, and what may you have to cover all the bases. And again, like we said, seems like they're trying to say, be careful what you say. And if you are going to specify, try to, less is more, as we say, try to say little. And if you are going to say, at least remember what you said so that you don't get stuck in these crazy extreme situations. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.